What is going on, everybody? AJ Reilly from Detroit Sports Nation here for another edition of The Corner with the Tigers actually playing some good baseball. They have won 2 out of 3 from the Baltimore Orioles. They just swept the Chicago White Sox and nixed their opportunity to win the Central Division. And now they're getting ready to take on the Royals. That's, if you're counting, 5 out of the last 6 games, the Detroit Tigers have won, and it's because they're playing good baseball. We're going to get into all that. We're going to talk about the series preview with the Royals, and we also have a special guest on the leadoff that we're going to get to very shortly. But I do want to remind you that wherever you are at in social media land, make sure that you are following Detroit Sports Nation. You know why? Because we have the best content out there and it comes at you quick. So make sure that you are following Detroit Sports Nation on all of your social media platforms. All right, so let's jump right into the leadoff today. And we actually have a special guest that's going to be joining us, and it is Mr. Lynn Henning, who worked with the Detroit News for Mr. Henning. You said, I don't want to age you, but you said like 40 something years, and you've covered the Tigers for almost 50 years. So there's no better person, I think, to have a discussion about the Tigers. Uh, than you. So I just want to thank you for taking some of your time to be here on the corner today.
Oh, glad to join you, AJ. Yeah, always fun to talk baseball, and I know your audience is pretty impassioned these days, particularly with the change in the GM's office.
It When Avila was fired and I went live on Facebook, it was probably the most watched video that we've done.
Well, I would
Uh,
think, yeah.
yeah, I mean, and it was an hour and a half that went very, very quickly because people were ready for a change in the garden. We got that changing of the garden. I want to talk about Scott Harris, but I know that you spent. I mean, most of your career was, you saw the '84 World Series, you saw the barren years of Randy Smith during the 90s and the '03 team, and then you saw the Dombrowski turnaround.
Sure.
So you've been very connected. So when we talk about this changing of the guard, I want to start with the last 7 years. And like, in your opinion, like what went wrong in those 7 years?
I can trace it really to one thing, and that is they just didn't get enough talent through the front door, and primarily through their drafts and through their international signings. And that's why I've always thought, AJ, that people have this a little bit backwards. They want to look at payroll. They get
Hmm.
really fixated on payroll. Even as the Indians, with a light payroll, are going to the playoffs for the fifth time in this last 7 years,
Hmm.
which proves, I think, conclusively in just one instance here that it's not about payroll. It's about the talent you're bringing in the youth stage. And that's where they have absolutely missed. Now, their drafts have been better the last 4 years, and that's going to be obvious increasingly over the next couple of years. And yet it's coming way too late.
Hmm.
And for that reason, you're going to have this collection of 100 lost seasons. Now, there are other factors that are involved. They had completely gotten into such deep red ink here that they had to get this payroll under control. It was
Sure.
absurd. The year in 2017 that they've got the worst record in baseball, they're paying luxury tax.
Yeah.
So this thing was just out of bounds in all respects. And Mike Ilitch,
Sure.
understandably, had gone right to the last breath trying to win a world championship. I understood that, but it was going to create problems with a rebuild, and it did. And then I think the other thing was the market turned around radically and dramatically, where it used to be able to spin off veterans for some pretty good talent. About 2017 is when front offices got this incredible sense of faith and commitment to this principle that you must hang on to your young talent. That's fairly legitimate, but they overreacted in some cases. And that's also why the Tigers ended up with a couple of big draft chips that they got very little in return for. And that was all a product of that market completely reversing in 2017 and maintaining it.
There could have been no worse time for the Tigers to enter a rebuild than is kind of what I hear. Because you think about 2017, right? You have JD Martinez, Justin Verlander, uh, Upton was traded at that time, Avila, and the closer, Justin Wilson, also at that time. And then I believe it was either that year or the following year they shipped off Kinsler after the season. Those were the only trade pieces that you had, unless you were willing to part with the Michael Fulmer, which, you know, you and I have disagreed about Tarek Skubal, and I must apologize because I thought you were crazy at first, but I said the same thing about Fulmer back then, and it makes sense now. It just, at the end of a rebuild, you don't want to be shipping off those young guys. Um, the JD Martinez one for me is the bigger bugaboo in a lot of ways. And I understand that, a light fielding power hitter is not going to draw a lot of attention. But when you ship them off on July 18th, instead of maybe waiting to see what happens in those next 2 weeks, do you think the return could have possibly increased a little bit?
I doubt it, AJ. And here's the reason I don't really second guess that trade. For one thing, he was going to go free agency. You couldn't buy him out of that. And so you could take a chance on the draft pick and so forth the next year, but you're probably better off at that point dealing for multiple players and giving yourself a chance for 1 out of 3, maybe 2 out of 3 to work. The problem with JD, and this is unforgivable on the part of Major League Baseball, the same with Verlander. There were 0 bidders for JD Martinez outside of the Arizona D-backs, who merely got 29 home runs from him in the final 62 games. 29 home runs in the final 62 games.
That's
Put him.
a home run every 2 games.
They were going to go away as a bidder in July. That's why Avila made that trade in July 18th. Everyone had steered clear of Martinez. They just weren't going to spend any of their precious draft picks or their young prospects on JD Martinez for a rental.
Yeah.
And he merely did really the impossible. I mean, that's an 80 home run pace
Right.
practically. So anyway, you had that nonsense going on. And for that reason, I didn't second guess the Tigers. I figured that was about as good as they could do, given that those 3 were not great prospects, but there was a chance for 2. As a matter of fact, 2 out of 3 did reach the big leagues. They weren't obviously long-term performers. They're not done yet in the case of Alcantara, but you just weren't going to get a boatload. So I didn't think there was any choice. It was the same situation with Verlander. And I've told this story before, but I sent Jeff Luhnow of the Astros an email 6 weeks before the trade deadline. And I'm talking about the August deadline.
Mm-hmm.
This is mid-July, saying, why are you guys not bidding for Jason or Justin Verlander? I said, I couldn't figure this thing out because I knew they weren't. I had enough context. There was nobody. I said, this is a Hall of Fame pitcher, and the Astros are 1 starter away from the World Series. How can you not be going after Justin Verlander? They didn't at the July deadline, and they weren't going to at the August deadline until Hinch and the owner got together and pressured Luhnow that evening, 2 hours before the deadline, to make the deal for Verlander.
Oh, I remember. I was refreshing Twitter quite often, trying to figure out what was going on.
And everybody wants to hang Avila for that deal. Frankly, I was stunned that night at what they got for him, because Franklin Perez was their number 1 prospect and a real thoroughbred. And then you had Rogers, who looked like he was going to at least be a backup in the big leagues at catcher. And then you had this first rounder and son of Mike Cameron, Daz Cameron, who looked like he might fulfill some dreams too. I thought it was a terrific trade because Justin Verlander was going to be wasted in Detroit. There was no point in carrying on with putting him out there every 5 days for a rebuilding club. He was better off going to a contender where he could do exactly what he's done for the Houston Astros. So I think people, they didn't get anything. Well, Franklin Perez, unless you had a crystal ball and foresaw the injury, he was an absolute blue chipper in that thing. And I don't blame a GM for a pitcher who had no injury history breaking down. I think that's just a tragic circumstance. But so I think people, that's where I disagree with critics and think they really don't have much basis for their outrage. Because to me, objectively, um, that was a very good and necessary deal at the time. And if anything, I thought the Tigers made out a lot better than it had probably expected to. At least that was my read on the market.
Yeah, my wish in that trade would have been someone like a Kyle Tucker, but
Oh,
give
yeah.
it for anybody, right? But I mean, that's a young guy that hadn't had much run at the major league level and could have been potentially involved, and I would
Yeah,
have liked.
except AJ, I'm going to interrupt you there because Luno was not partying with Kyle Tucker.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
was the package they were going to get, and they knew Tucker was, and everybody wanted Tucker. But
right.
guess what? The GM for
Nobody
the
was
other team
getting.
didn't want him out.
Yeah,
So
I
I
know. It's
understand
wishful
objectively.
thinking, right? It's wishful
Oh yeah,
thinking.
and I mean we're great at making up trades. How could you not have traded this guy for this guy? You mean to tell me they didn't offer? Guess what? The realities, as we know, of the trade market are usually dramatically different from anything that we're seeing from the sidelines.
Th- uh, So then the onus for Avila's tenure then is more on his roster construction than the trade. Which I mean, the roster trades aside, the roster construction is not
Exactly.
not great. Which you
Exactly.
said at the beginning, but there's plenty around Detroit in the media that has said, listen, the last 7 years at this point, they're sunk cost. Right? There's nothing. You can't do anything about them. They've happened. There's no reason to continue to just look at them and be like, okay, woulda, coulda, shoulda. We now have Scott Harris, and it's time to move forward with Scott Harris. You and I talked even before um, the hire was made, and I had messaged you with this tweet of all these names that were thrown out there, and you're like, listen, the Burns from the Dodgers is who has like the most traction, but there's not a lot of info out there right now because the Tigers have been very,
Oh,
very locked
whew,
in their information.
was this top secret, man?
Was Harris a surprise?
Yeah, he was. I thought we had most of the young guys identified. I'm talking about nationally, and he was one, and I can't explain why he sort of slipped past everyone's scrutiny. But he of course adds up tremendously in terms of credentials. But back to Burns, he thought he had the job. I think AJ Hinch thought he had the job. I thought he had the job. A number of other people nationally thought he was going to the Tigers. And this came as a brutal blow to him when he got the
Mm,
phone call that he wasn't going to be Detroit's GM. He was really primed for this job. And I think all of us expected, I think as the manager of the Tigers was rubbing his hands too. But I think they also, AJ, I think they got a tremendously bright and baseball astute kid. And I'm going to say kid because he's 35, 36.
he's my age, which
Yeah.
you want to feel a little insignificant.
Oh,
Here I
no.
am on a blog and he's running a baseball team, but
But
my goodness,
that's a great time to hire because people are
right?
usually blossoming and really hitting their point of fruition at about that age professionally.
Hmm.
And what I kept saying about the Tigers was everybody wanted Theo Epstein and they wanted to hire Luno and they wanted all of these people whose names
Hmm.
already were established. And I said, why don't the Tigers find their own Theo Epstein, their
Right.
own Andrew Friedman, their own Mike Elias? And they have endeavored to do just that. And I think they got, frankly, a pretty good chance to have their own industry standard here because this kid is not only, I keep using that word, this gentleman is not only extremely bright and accomplished, and it's not because of diplomas he's getting hired. Anybody that tosses that out is just playing nonsense games.
Mhm.
He's got a brilliant baseball background now after 10 years with some very sharp people. And all of that, I think that insight that does help on the business side, you've got to figure out whether somebody is worth extending or not. The Tigers haven't been very good at that.
Yeah.
They've made some critically bad choices. They may have made another one last year with Baez, although, if September is any indicator, they might survive this thing. But clearly, when you have business acumen involved in that, the risks, when to sell for 60 cents on the dollar. Gregory Soto comes to mind there. I think should have been absolutely moved for 40 cents on the dollar, if that were possible. And I haven't had my conversation yet with Al Avila to go over the autopsy, so to speak, of
Sure.
7 years. But I think he's going to tell me we couldn't even get a bite on him. I suspect that's what I'm going to hear, or at least not for anything other than a bag of balls. But that's separate from the fact that business people who've had a great exposure to analytics through these years and know how the personnel must be assembled, know the scouting side, are going to be pretty good at their job. And I think this gent is going to be really, I think he's probably going to end up as a pretty successful story in Detroit.
Yeah, and you said something that kind of resonated with what they said in the press conference. Even in the press conference, they said you can try and replicate what everybody does, but it's
Right.
not going. You're not going to do it as well. So going
Exactly.
after a name like a Zaidi or a Friedman or a Theo Epstein, innovate with somebody like a Harris, who is, what he, I forget the exact quote, but like he's concerned with innovation. He wants to
Yeah.
innovate, which is exciting, especially when you're coming off of what we've come off of. I did think it was kind of telling though, and you'll have a little bit more to say about this, but I'm sure you caught the smirk in the press conference when he talked about the Giants' view of the Tigers farm system.
Yeah.
Uh, how telling do you think that is, and how concerned should Tigers fans be?
Oh, I think he probably wasn't being quite as mocking there as some of us it may have written it. But I do think he understands they're at the bottom 10 now of all minor league teams. That's because so many of these guys obviously noted Torkelson and
Mhm.
Green. They're real thoroughbreds are already now in Detroit. But he understands that this system right now is the problem and has been the problem for 40 years. And it has been. It's been a problem since the 70s when Trammell and Gibson and Whitaker and Parrish and Morris and Petrie and all those guys were drafted all in one big clump. And the Tigers haven't come close to replicating that in any kind of a draft for all these years. So he probably has seen that very superficially and certainly saw it with the Giants. Every team, AJ, knows each other's
Mhm.
rosters, their minor league systems intimately. There aren't any mysteries out there. There can't be any more in baseball. So they know it very, very, very comprehensively from A to Z what the Tigers have and don't have. Now, what they are also going to know is in 2 years, son of a gun, there was a little more talent there than we thought.
Sure.
There was Colt Keith, and there was Jace Young, and there was Parker Meadows, maybe, and there was maybe Dingler or maybe Crouch, or you could, and of course the pitching, and that's one thing I'll give Avila credit for, even in this catastrophic year where they lost pitchers by the week. Their pitching held up pretty well this year.
Did.
Now,
Yeah.
if you're going to nail him on one thing, you got to credit him on the other. And they've
For
got a
sure.
lot of arms in the system. Flores is going to be a top of the rotation guy down in Erie. Ty Madden has a chance to be really pretty good. We forget about Faedo. We forget about
Mhm.
all these guys coming back next year. Turnbull.
Turnbull. Yeah.
Um, they've got a lot of pitching. Reese Olson down at, I don't know if he's going to end up as a reliever or as a
Who
starter,
they
but
got? Who they got for Kinsler, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
they got Reese Olson in the Daniel Norris deal.
In Norris. That's right. Yes.
Yeah, and Joey Wentz is really going to be a
Hmm.
factor here. Well, that's suddenly Avila's going to end up getting a little more credit than people have been inclined to give him as he's gone out the door here, because he did trade for some pretty crucial pieces. Alex Lang is not half bad at all. They got some help here, and they're going to have it on both sides. They're still deficient, in my estimation, in terms of the slugging outfielder. Now, Meadows has a chance, based on what he's done at Double-A this year, to be a center fielder, and that moves Riley Green to left. That would be an ideal situation. They need a kid like Roberto Campos to come through and finally end that drought of the international signings not paying off for them.
Yeah, he was
Campos,
the big international signing a few years ago that kind of caught everybody off guard, right? Like, if I remember correctly, he was the one that nobody really knew anything about, but projected very well.
Yeah, he was from Cuba, and then they migrated to the Dominican Republic. It was a complicated deal, but they, of course, at the time paid him more money than they'd ever paid any international signee, 2.85. And he's got a chance next year. I think we could be talking about him big time. So it's not a barren landscape that Scott Harris comes into here at all. But there's going to be a lot of work to replace working parts now that aren't functioning terribly well. I don't see how they tender Jamer Candelario next year.
Yeah.
Scope, I thought that 2-year deal last summer was a bad signing. And of course, people loved it because they loved that the Tigers were spending money. It seemed like for so long, people didn't really care whether they won or lost, but are you going to spend some money today? So they spent $240 million in the offseason, and look what that got them. Which is why I go back to that original point.
Payroll.
People have been looking at down the wrong end of the gun barrel on this thing. It's not payroll. There's a point where payroll will complement what you are building with the youth, but it takes the foundation first, and that's got to be young players and young talent.
And I mean, there seems to be a little bit of a foundation, kind of like Kerry Carpenter has been a revelation this year, and I think can be, not he's not going to be a superstar, but he can be a solid, middle of the order type bat. Ryan Kreidler could, solidify, I think, the left side of the infield for sure, especially if Javi continues to struggle throwing the ball to first base, right? That's a whole nother discussion for a whole nother time, is Javier Baez. But like those two to then complement Green and Torkelson, there's a little bit of a foundation along with the arms that we've already talked about. But again, having a step back from Akil Baddoo this year, not working in the favor of moving forward, right? And then the younger guys that you talk to. But I want to ask you about his vision, right? Scott Harris talked about his vision. He said, I want to acquire, develop, and retain young talent. He wants to make sure that he keeps those guys, which almost sounds like an Atlanta Braves type strategy. I think what the Braves have done with their young talent and extending them early is just
brilliant.
Genius. It is. Like, get those guys off of worrying about arbitration and free agency and keep that core of your group together for 7, 8, 9 years and pay them. It might be a little bit less than their value, but there's a give and take there. But then he also talked about commanding the strike zone, which we know for this historically bad offense this year. I mean, we're talking about coming in and scoring less runs than the 2019 team, scoring less runs than the 2003 team, and striking out an awful lot. Do you think that he's basically saying, hey, here's the flair, and everybody needs to be on notice?
What I thought was the most prominent part of that whole introductory address was just that, the strike zone concentration, because clearly this was going past the point of the normal, well, we're going to ask our hitters to swing at strikes and we're going to throw low fastballs for strikes, et cetera, et cetera. That's normally what you get, and that's what you got from the Tigers for decades. This guy is going to make sure that on base average and that fewer strikeouts rather than more is going to be a requisite skill for their lineup people. he's going to make sure that people like Gregory Soto don't come into a ball game leaving all of his teammates worried about how many he's going to put on base. That
Right.
stuff is not going to fly with Scott Harris. And
And it
that's why I
shouldn't
thought,
fly.
no, and it shouldn't fly is right. And that's why I thought for him to make this the second point of his address tells you that this is going to be sacrosanct with him. And it will. And that's great. Now, they haven't really gotten serious with on base average in their drafts until this year. Notice, though, how they finally got religion. But it's all been so late. The
Yeah.
question abounds. Why wasn't this stuff done earlier? And that's going to be Al's epitaph.
Mm-hmm.
Why wasn't this stuff done earlier? And that, to me, is where the scouts and the scouting directors bear a tremendous responsibility for the simple fact this roster has been so absolutely deficient at 7-year mark of the rebuild. Now, a year ago, we were not having this conversation. It looked like things
Mm-mm.
were on track. But that ended up being kind of a false floor. And, this year, even though this was such a sadistic year,
It was.
the injuries were, you can't even measure anything by this
Well, I
year.
mean, you make the trade for Austin Meadows, right? And
Yeah. And then
who expects him to get vertigo and 2 Achilles injuries, and then also dealing, with mental health issues, which we hope
right.
that he's doing well. Like, we
Yes.
wish him the best, but who expected that? And then the guy that you trade him for, or traded to the Rays for him, goes on. And look, Paredes has not been phenomenal, but he's hit 20 home runs. He leads their team in
Yeah.
home runs, and it's like, okay, maybe you gave up on him a little bit too early, but there's certain things you would have needed a crystal ball for, like you said earlier. Um, I want to go back to that on base percentage, right? That you were talking about, and why didn't they do this earlier? You have for a long time reading your tweets and conversing with you. You are not a fan of the dimensions of Comerica Park, and so my question is, and this is a little bit off script, but AJ said it last week. Like, we can't. Riley Green hit that massive bomb to center field that got caught right at the wall. Right, it just should have been a home run in just about every other ballpark. And AJ says, "Listen, we play here 81 times a year. We can't pout. We can't complain about the dimensions. We got to build a roster that fits the ballpark." Right? When Scott Harris comes in and on the broadcast with Bally Sports starts quoting OPS plus, right? The on base plus slugging adjusted to your park. I think that's a sign that fans can be like, oh, this is going to be a little bit different.
Except my question, AJ, is the question I've asked from the start. How do you build a hitter to deal with 81 games at Comerica Park and 81 at the rest of the big league parks? It's completely mad science.
It
How do
is.
you deal with the fact that Riley Green, who's a good hitter, or Spencer Torkelson, who is a good hitter and going to be a really good hitter, are occasionally going to hit the ball 425 feet because they hit it really well, and expect them to live with the out, and you are expected to get a roster that somehow deals with this nonsense? Let's go back to the start. Comerica Park was built to protect lousy pitchers and to punish good hitters. I repeat, Comerica Park was laid out to protect bad pitching and to be punitive to good hitters.
Yeah, you were there right in the middle of it when they were building it.
And I said before it was ever opened, I said, change it now because you're just going to have to fix this thing later. Sure enough, after 2 years, well, then Dave Dombrowski came in, and he didn't even know how bad it was until he saw that first full season as GM. By the end of the year, they had plans then to relocate the bullpens, pull that absurd left field in, et cetera, et cetera. But they only fixed part of it. They still had left center all the way to right center, 437, 430, 425. Look,
Yeah.
you can't simply, well, let's get speed and line drive hitters. every team wants speed and line drive hitters. They're going to hold up in any ballpark. But
Right.
what you're going to do is take your power hitters who occasionally can hit a ball 425 feet, and you're just going to say, sorry, Charlie, you should have blooped one in there. That
Yeah.
is the most asinine philosophy for stadium design I have ever seen, and they've lived with it for 23 years.
Well, and
Enough.
what people forget is that back wall of the bullpen was the original wall, if I'm not mistaken, right? The Tigers that
That
was
was
the
you had to hit
original
it out there.
wall
You had
that
to
they
clear
moved.
the bullpen in order to hit a home run there.
And how many balls nowadays do we see clearing? Like, not a ton. And I wonder how, the effect that had on Miguel because,
Oh,
Miguel is that, he's right center field gap kind of guy. Like, he likes to push the ball that way. So, I mean, yeah, it definitely killed a few home runs that he's
oh,
hit for
Chris
sure.
And if you saw Chris McCaskey's story this week, he had it all boiled down statistically. It's cost Miguel Cabrera 100 home runs. He'd be at 600 instead of 500, and that's legitimate. JD Martinez lost tons there. Maglio, I don't care who you're talking about.
Yeah.
They've all paid the price. Well, people say, but it's still run neutral, and no, don't give me that nonsense. You get a lot of bloop singles there because
Sure.
outfielders play so deep
Hmm.
that you're going to have. There's no integrity to a bloop single beating the ball that's just been crushed 430 feet to the auxiliary scoreboard and ends up as an F8.
No,
See that?
especially when you talk about runs expectancy, right? Like run expectancy 24, all those different analytics. It's
That's
a
where
bloop single
statistics
is not worth a home run.
and right, and that's where numbers can be distorted and where they outright can lie.
Right.
So it's all you do, AJ, to fix that thing is you pull, and they're going to apparently finally do it after.
Oh,
Yeah,
they are, huh?
yeah. Chris's story this past week and a half or so, I had it all laid out, and I would invite you to go back and read
I
that.
will. I
It's a
actually missed
tremendous
that one,
piece.
so I will.
Yeah, they're going to finally do something about it because
Good.
Inch and everyone have finally seen now that they've got Torkelson Green, which is exactly what I said before they were called up. I said, you're just going to ruin these kids with this craziness, this
Well, and
insanity.
you saw that with Torkelson in his first 198 at bats. He's trying to push everything to right center field because that's where the biggest gap is, and he's late on everything.
It just messes up good hitters. And that's the
Yeah.
worst thing you can do to guys who are assigned the most difficult feat in all of sports. So I've been screaming about it for 25 years for a good reason. I think
You're being heard, Lynn. You're finally being heard.
it's injustice. It's always been absolutely uh, sadistic, and
Mhm.
they're finally, I think, going to get off their stubbornness and fix it.
Hopefully before next season, or are these plans
Yeah,
for like,
yeah, I
oh,
think so.
interesting. That's going to be fantastic. Okay, I have one final question for you, and again, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the corner here and talking baseball because
Oh,
it's
happy to,
my
AJ. Yeah.
favorite thing. I stayed up last night to watch Pujols hit 700,
Oh man,
raising my arms and like I was very excited
that's
for
fun.
him. Had my son up watching Judges at bats last night, hoping that he would hit 61. He's 5. He doesn't really understand it at this point, but it was something my dad did in '98, so it was something
You
that I
bet.
wanted to do for him. Here's my final question to you: what is Scott Harris's biggest challenge this offseason? Is it Miggy, and what can he do?
Um, Cabrera is, diplomatically speaking, his biggest challenge, right? And I think they are going to come to an agreement between Cabrera, whose pride does not really allow him to think about being less than the player he can be next year. So I think he, his agent, the doctors, and the Tigers will come to a mutual agreement that there's no point pushing this into 2023. Let's satisfy the contract financially. Tigers will have no issue there. And then let's have a big Miguel Cabrera Day next spring and make it a weekend festival and send him outright. As far as his other assignment, it's going to figure out how many people can I replace or how effectively with a minimum amount of trade chips. Now, I
Mhm.
will add this, AJ, real quickly. I think this offseason is not going to pose as many opportunities to deal as it will next summer, when I think they're going to have a true stockpile of excellent pitching. And I think next July, with Scott Harris entering his first trade deadline, I think that could be fireworks for the Tigers.
Yeah. Yeah, I would definitely I don't really even know what moves other than the non-tendering of certain players. Potentially in May, if Scope is still doing what he's doing, I could see him getting a, DFA or something to that
Yeah,
extent. But this offseason, I mean, looking at free agents, unless Correa opts out and they make a run at him, I, I don't really know what the moves are to be made other than maybe, you know, we forget that the Giants, since Harris has been there, has been able to identify veteran players who have gotten better.
right.
Kevin Gausman, I believe, is one of them, specifically pitching. That they've been able, which is not the Tigers' lack right now, but so it'll be interesting to see, like you said, the moves and who he can replace effectively. Um, but not just player wise. I think there's going to be some coaches on the chopping block potentially as well. Um,
That's likely. I don't know that any GM would come in from the outside and not have uh, a fairly significant number of changes that he's going to make,
yeah,
both in terms of staff and, of course, primarily with the roster. He is going to be aggressive. I know that for a fact. And I think I'd play the over on any amount of deals that lead to a juggling of that roster going into 2023.
it would be a welcome sight for sure, especially when we talk about how bad roster construction has been. I mean, in our lineup, there's maybe two that would play on a playoff team right now. I could see maybe Riley Green coming off the bench, and I could see maybe Javi Baez doing something on a playoff contender. But other than that, I don't know who else in our lineup would be on a contending team.
I think you're
Uh,
right.
so it'll be interesting. Lynn, I am so thankful for you and your time to spend here on the corner with me. It went a little bit longer, but that tends to happen when we start talking about baseball. So
That's
I
right.
appreciate your time very much and you coming on and answering my questions about Scott Harris and what the last 7 years have been. It's my absolute pleasure to have you on this show.
I enjoyed the conversation, AJ. Anytime.
Thank you very much. And we will get into the recap of the Tigers and the White Sox coming up next. All right, so we want to jump into that recap. Let's talk about the Tigers at the Chicago White Sox, and I am happy to say that my prediction was wrong. I said that the Tigers would, split the series, the remaining 6 games with the Chicago White Sox. Well, guess what? They have not split with the Chicago White Sox over those 6 games. They actually won the series of 6 games 4-2. They lost 2 games in Detroit and then swept them in Chicago. And I cannot be happier to say that my prediction was wrong. And in fact, I was also wrong about the Baltimore Orioles series. I like being wrong in these instances. You know why? Because it means that they're actually ahead of schedule as far as those 100 losses go. After this Orioles and White Sox series, I had the Tigers at 4-5. Guess what? They are 6-3 in these last 9 games. 2 better than where I had them, which means that they could avoid 100 losses. Here's the deal. They have 10 games left. They need to go 6-4. 5-5 would be great, but they need to go 6-4. It would be phenomenal to end the series on a high note. It would be great for them to be able to, kind of take the little bit of bad taste that's been in the mouth as far as this season in and of itself has gone. But to get to 65 wins, 66 wins, and only 4 more losses, which would put them at 96, look, that's better than being a 100-loss club, so that's where we want to go. But the best thing about this weekend, they played spoiler. You heard Torkelson talk about it. He said that's kind of been the mindset. We want to ruin somebody's season. Yeah, guess what? They ruined the White Sox season. The White Sox are now eliminated from division contention. They still have an opportunity, kind of, in the wild card, but they're 7.5 games back from that final wild card spot and have to jump the Baltimore Orioles. Man, the Tigers did a good thing this weekend. They kept those pesky White Sox out of the playoffs, and it looks like they just ended their season entirely. Here's the thing. Let's recap this series, right? It was a sweep. It was a phenomenal opportunity, and the Tigers played fantastic. Complete team performance. Great defense, timely hitting, solid pitching, and man, it was fun to watch. I had a discussion with a friend who was saying that we have the greatest GM in baseball now, which there is truth. If you saw my video from last week about the Scott Harris effect, reports came out that the team was required to watch that press conference, and they've been playing better baseball since that press conference. Don't tell me that's not a coincidence. That's definitely a coincidence. Or it's not a coincidence. It's the fact that he lit a fire. He said, this is what I'm looking for, and if you want a job next year, you've got to do this. It's what we talked about with Lynn Henning in the leadoff. And if anybody knows or has an idea of how things could and should transpire, it's a guy that's covered baseball for 50 years. So I do want to, again, thank Lynn for jumping on the program with me. But here is the deal, and let's talk about this for a second. Javi Baez, the man is a machine when he comes to playing in Chicago. The fact that he's getting booed by everybody and kind of thriving on the boos. But let's talk about his September. 354 with a 973 OPS and 4 home runs. A much different player than what we saw at the beginning of the season. Now, I understand. Why couldn't this have happened sooner? Why is he just now starting to hit? Blah, 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 blah. I get all of that. I understand all of that. But this should be an encouraging sign. Especially when you realize that when Javi was playing his best ball with the Cubs, there was a guy named Scott Harris involved in that team as well, learning at the feet of Theo Epstein. And if Scott Harris is all about development and all about players getting better while they're here, then it should be exciting for us to think about what is going to happen with Javi Baez. So what a great series it was. It was a phenomenal way for the Tigers to, kind of kick off these last 10 games, get that sweep of the White Sox, win 2 out of 3 from the Orioles, which, I mean, goodness gracious, we're 5-1 over the last 6, and we're 6-3 over the last 9. Like, it's good. It's good baseball. It's something that you definitely want to see from this club. Young guys making contributions. Kerry Carpenter hitting the ball well. Riley Green just playing an outstanding center field. Just what a great series in Chicago this was for the Tigers. It's a little too late, for sure. It's a little too late, but it's what you want to see. I've told you show after show after show after show. This is what you want to see. You want to see improvements. You do not want to see this team stay the same. You want to see them actually get better, and they seem to be playing better baseball towards the end of the seasons here. And that needs to continue. When they take on the Kansas City Royals here starting Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday in Detroit, it is the last homestand. The Tigers have an opportunity to win a season series against the Royals, something that they have not done in a few years. Right now in the season, we're 7-9 against the Royals. You sweep the Royals and go 9-3 in your last 12. Holy cow, could you imagine? You sweep the Royals and you have won a season series. It's the final homestand. The Twins are going to be coming in for the weekend set. But right now, we have to deal with the team at hand, which is the Royals. And here's the deal, okay? The Royals, they've had our number. The Royals, they have, been pesky, as we have called them on this show quite often. But they're susceptible. And we proved that last time we were in Kansas City because we played pretty well against them the last time that they were in Kansas City. So here's some pitching matchups that I want to get to. The Tigers right now are all to be determined. Now you're looking at somebody like Joey Wentz. You're looking at Matt Manning, potentially Tyler Alexander, No, not Tyler Alexander on Wednesday, but you're looking at Eduardo Rodriguez, Drew Hutchinson. Any of those guys could potentially fit into this mix. You're definitely going to see Joey Wentz. You're definitely going to see Matt Manning. The question is when. We don't know because it's all to be determined for whatever reason, trying to get these guys extra rest or whatever the case may be. In Game 1 for the Royals, Tuesday at 6:40, Zach Greinke is going to be towing the rubber, and he's Zach Greinke, right? You got to get to him early. You got to get to Zach Greinke and not let him dominate. The goal would be for you to be able to knock him out as quickly as possible because of their bullpen, which has not been fantastic on the season. We've talked about this, before. Their bullpen has been, pretty low down the leaderboards. It's something to write home about, and so it's definitely one of those situations where you want to get to that 27th ranked bullpen. They're just not good, so get there as quickly as you can. And it all starts going back to like the Chicago series, right? In that Chicago series, they put pressure on them right from the get-go. They were Riley Green setting the table, Javi Baez driving the ball, putting runs on the board in the first inning, and the Tigers are better when they score runs in the first inning, which obviously the more runs you score, the more often you score them, is going to be the way to go. But keep putting that pressure, keep setting that table for the rest of the players. Here's a breakdown on Zach Greinke, right? Strikes out about 5 per 9, walks about 2 per 9. He has a 3.14 batting average on balls in play. He's got a 4.21 ERA and a 4.13 FIP. So not a lot of bad luck, good luck as far as his pitching has gone. And the key is going to be for the Tigers to get to him early. On Game 2, in Wednesday, 6:40, Daniel Lynch is going to be facing off again against to be determined. Lynch on the season has strikes out about 9 per 9 innings, walks almost 4 per 9 innings, has a 3.38 batting average on balls in play, a 5.06 ERA, and a 4.56 WHIP. It's again, the Tigers have gotten to him previously when he faced the Tigers last, September 9th. He only went 3 2/3 innings, gave up 6 earned runs. I mean, the Tigers have seen him before. The game before that, when he faced the Tigers on the 9th, he only went 5 innings, gave up 4 earned runs. So in his last 2 starts against the Tigers, runs. Make sure that you're taking that specific game plan to Daniel Lynch again to make sure that you are getting, again, to that terrible bullpen that they have, because they're not good. The key, though, is going to be Game 3 against Jonathan Heasley, who's 4-8 with a 4.87 ERA on the season. He walks about 4 per 9 innings, strikes out about 6 per 9 inning, has a 2.66 ERA. Not ERA, 2.66 batting average on balls in play. He's got a 4.87 ERA with a 5.42 WHIP, which indicates that he's actually gotten a lot luckier in the way that he has pitched than his ERA would indicate. Last time out against the Tigers, he only went 4 innings with 7 earned runs. But the time before that, he set a career high, going 7 innings and only giving up 2 earned runs. So it's kind of a mixed bag with Heasley, right? You got to get to him again like you did in Kansas City. Don't go out there and let a pitcher who has not pitched well dominate you. If you want to make sure that you are winning this series at minimum, potentially sweeping it and winning the season series, it's all going to come down to the offense. Can you put the ball in play against 3 pitchers who have, not been great? 3 pitchers who, Greinke's Greinke, right? I don't want to, mess with him, but you're missing Brady Singer, which is huge. So just to go back to Greinke for a second, let's talk about him. The last time he pitched against Detroit was way back in April. 2 earned runs over 5 1/3 innings pitched. No other time have we seen him this season. So there's definitely going to be some adjustment that the Tigers have to approach him with, right? See pitches. Make sure that you're getting strikes, commanding the strike zone as Scott Harris. And then, look, defensively, you got to turn batted balls into outs, because if the Royals get on base, they're a good base running team that can create a lot of runs. And the key is going to be putting balls in play into outs, making them into outs. Cannot give them extra at-bats, cannot give them extra outs, because if you do, they will create havoc for you. It will create a situation where the Tigers are, playing from behind, and you just don't want to do that. If you're pitching against the Royals, you have to beat them in the strike zone. You have to make sure that you're getting soft contact, that you're converting that soft contact into outs, and then you're pushing runs across the plate against their pitchers. Because look, there's 10 games left. You want to go 6-4, you got to win 2 of these. You got 3 more with Minnesota this weekend, and then you got 4 out in Seattle, which are going to be very tough. So you really, really, really need to make sure you can win the games that you can win. And these are 3 games that the Tigers can win, and it's going to be dependent upon them to play good baseball and make sure that they win these games, as they have been, right? As they have been. So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens over these 3 games. I know I will be tuned in. We are going to call it quits on the corner right now with that recap and that preview. I want to thank Lynn Henning again for joining me for the leadoff to discuss Scott Harris and all that has transpired with the Tigers over the recent years. I will be back on Thursday to recap this Royals series and preview the Minnesota series. And until then, as always, go Tigers.